Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today we're doing the recap for week 2 of the 2022 Overwatch League season. I'm still a little sick, so there may be some cutting in this video or some noticeable moments. I feel mostly good, except for when I sit down to record and I talk for long periods of time. That's when my cough comes back, so bear with me just a little bit longer. Hopefully this week I get over it. But let's throw out my picks from last week. You guys can take a look at them. You can see them here. Overall, my record was 6-3 this week. 1-1 on my big pick games. Interesting week, some really interesting results, some interesting matches that did not go the way that I expected them to go. So let's dive in. Let's start talking about them. I'm going to try to focus more on teams as a whole. I did not get to really sit down and watch every game in depth as much as I normally would like to. So I'm going to kind of talk about the takeaways I had for each team, the things that teams did well, didn't do well, in particular matches, as well as kind of their week as a whole, when I get kind of their second match, if they had one, or if they didn't, then just their first match, whatever it was. So starting with Friday, we had the Florida Mayhem. Sorry about that. The Florida Mayhem taking on the Vancouver Titans. This game was pretty one-sided in favor of the Mayhem. Titans really, to me, kind of just did not perform well, and that was pretty obvious. This is the first game with Mirror. They just did weird things. I didn't really think that the Titans don't really know exactly what it is that they wanted to do. I don't think they understood their full identity, or I don't know if it's coaching. I think this roster is too talented for me to not question if it's a coaching problem. Because ever since the current coaching staff took over, they have won very few matches, and they've won 6 games in the past 3 years. Or since Wubby took over as head coach, they've won like almost nothing. They might not even have 6 wins; it might be like 5 wins. It's a very, 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 very rough record for this team ever since their current coaching staff took over. And I just think they've been doing a lot of weird things, a lot of bizarre things. So I'm really interested to see what happens with this team going forward, to see if they kind of fix a lot of their issues that they have had, because I really do think this team has been a bit of a bit of a nightmare to watch. They just have not had it together. They have not looked very good. They've not looked like a team that really has it together, and they've been super inconsistent, which is the biggest problem with this Titans team. The Mayhem are a team that look like they're just kind of good. They feel very Valiant-like from back in 2020, where they just look like they're a roster with talent and really good coaching that is just kind of like diamonds in the rough that are going to be polished as the season progresses and are going to get better and better and better. And they're a team to keep an eye out, because that is what they looked like this weekend. In this match, they really just were able to just roll over the Titans. Titans did not look good in the slightest. The one big pick game I got right this week was the Shock over the Outlaws. It was a 3-1 win for the Shock, but it was relatively close at times, especially as the series kind of got towards the latter half. Outlaws obviously won their map 3, map 4, had some moments that were pretty close, but ultimately it went the way of the Shock. Shock, of course, also took on the NYXL on Sunday. So they still have yet to play a really tough opponent yet. They haven't played, a Fuel, a Rain, a Gladiators, a Justice. These teams that we're looking at right now as kind of top level teams, even potentially like the Toronto Defiant, who I think look very good. Those are the teams that the Shock have not played yet. If you just to kind of look at the overall standings, yeah, they played the London Spitfire, who technically are doing well right now, but we'll see how much that goes. But their wins are over a Spitfire, Outlaws, Eternal, and Excelsior teams, which are all, with the exception of the Spitfire, in the bottom half of the Western region standings so far. It's early, so that can obviously change. It's not telling you that much, but the Shock look good. I don't want to read too much into it yet, though. I want to see them play against those top-level teams to see how well they perform against those teams. They are, they've only dropped 2 maps all season so far, the Shock, so that still tells you quite a bit about how good this team is, that they are still a very high-level team. They're still a very high-performing team, very well-performing team. I want to see more out of them against some of those better teams. So once we get to those bigger games, I believe they have some coming up here at the end of this tournament cycle. We'll have a much better idea of what this Shock roster is. The Outlaws, on the other hand, I still think they are not flexible enough in the tank role. Piggy will play the off tank, and when he comes in, they tend to do pretty well. But they look their best when Dante is on the Doomfist. The problem with Dante playing Doomfist is that that's all he's going to play when he comes in. And so I'm concerned that that will become this team's identity. They'll become too one-dimensional, too reliant on Dante's Doomfist, and that they don't actually then, as a result, kind of put up good results or have any kind of power in their new compositions, right? I don't think we're going to see new compositions out of them if they're running a lot of Doomfist tank. So I'm curious to see what happens with this Outlaws team. They look to me like a better NYXL because they have a little more flexibility in the DPS line. I think Lasher has picked up the main support role better than what you have with Gangnam Jin on New York. And so Outlaws, to me, have shown more than the NYXL. They look like a better version of the NYXL, which is why I think it's interesting that those are the two teams that the Shock played against this weekend, because I think they're two very comparable teams in terms of the way that their roster is kind of designed and built up. And it'll be interesting to see what happens to both these teams going forward. But the Outlaws, to me, have a much higher ceiling than the Excelsior do right now. I'm just concerned that the Outlaws are going to be a very easy read come tournament time. But we'll see as we get closer to that. Biggest game to me on Friday, the biggest surprise, was the Washington Justice not just beating the Atlanta Reign, completely 3-0ing and manhandling the Atlanta Reign. This game was not close. Let me be fair. This game was not close. There were times where maybe it was a little close. Like Eichenwalde, you thought that maybe the Reign would take it because the Justice's push didn't go super far, but no, the Justice stopped the Reign before they could even get there. And so this match to me was a huge shocker. And it really goes into, I think, what we're seeing with this Justice team is that the biggest place where they have improved and have changed and have evolved is that support line and with Happy. They made some big changes to the roster. Some of that central core is still there. They still have Assassin and Decay and Mag from last season. But they bring in Kalios, who doesn't get a ton of playtime, but he does get playtime. So I'd mention him. They have Opener, and they have Krillin, and they have Happy. And those three in particular, Opener, Krillin, and Happy, have had a huge impact. Krillin played really, really well this weekend. And we know when Vigilante is able to play that he's probably going to be the starter. But Krillin played well this weekend, and I think he really put himself in a position to, make big plays, have big impact. And I thought it was really interesting the way that they adapted to the Tracer compositions, because Tracer was pretty much not played at all during the first weekend. And then we saw the Shock and we saw the Justice pick up that Tracer. We saw Proper on the Tracer, we saw Decay on the Tracer, and they were difference makers. They really did change the tempo of the game. They completely changed the outlook of the game. And those two got pretty significantly better. Well, maybe not significantly better, but they looked better with that Tracer composition being played. And so I think there is quite a it is quite a big deal that we're seeing Tracer kind of getting picked up, and we didn't see the Reign really adapt to that. We didn't see them put Venom in on the Tracer. They just stuck with Nero on the Tracer. And so that's something that I think will be interesting to see as we get to the end of this tournament cycle. Do we see a lot more Tracer get played, or is this kind of a 1 week kind of niche thing where Tracer has played a lot to counter Echo compositions? Echo is getting kind of big. How does that go? How does that benefit teams like New York or teams like the Boston Uprising, who have players who we kind of traditionally would consider elite Tracer players, but these are teams that haven't been playing very well. So do we see a shift to those teams to playing a lot more Tracer? I don't know. Those are kind of my takeaways from that game, though. I thought it was an interesting game, though, and I definitely was amazed by the performance of the Justice put up there, and impressed and happy to see the Justice really kind of putting it up where I think that they looked better than I had expected them to. So that was a good thing to see. London Spitfire versus the Boston Uprising was an interesting match. Spitfire looking pretty good. I think they have an identity now, which is something that they didn't really have last season. They know who they are. They know, Hottie on the Rush, Hottie on the Reinhardt. This team knows what they are. They're going to do what they can do. This is a pretty convincing win over the Uprising. The Uprising, I think, has some issues. There's too many subs that they're making. They'll have Marvel in, then they'll bring Punk in, and then they'll have MCD, and then they'll have Crimzo, and DPS really, to me, is the only place you should be making regular substitutions. There's some exceptions, like with the Gladiators. I think if you're going to play Brig for an entire map, then yeah, I think putting Skewed in is a good move. But most of the time, I think the only place you really want to be making regular substitutions is kind of niche hero picks in like the tank or support role, or with DPS. It's a little different this season because we're only one tank now. So like if you are going to run Winston and you're Dallas, for example, you're going to want Fearless. But if you're going to be playing Diva, you're going to want Hanbin. So that is kind of the exception. But Spitfire have an identity. They look good. And I think it's interesting. I think that they are performing at a decently high level, which is what we kind of expect from them last season. They haven't had to play anybody really good yet, except for the Shock, right? Their wins are against a poor Titans team and a poor Uprising team, relatively poor Uprising team. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens when they go up against another kind of good opponent. But a win is a win, and you have to give them credit for walking away from this weekend with a pretty convincing win over an Uprising squad that has not been terrible, but has definitely had some struggles so far this season. The Spitfire really have solidified their identity much quicker and figured that out. So good on them for that one. The second big pick of the game, probably one of the best games of the weekend, was the Dallas Fuel reverse sweeping the LA Gladiators. I was so ready to become insufferable and talk about how great the Gladiators are. And I still think the Gladiators are great. And I think there's really no denying that the Gladiators are still among the best teams in this region. One of the criticisms people had of this team was that they played weak opponents in week one, didn't look amazing, didn't look super coordinated at times, looked a little rough at times. The fact that they were, a map away from beating the Fuel, and it really was some issues with coordination, some kind of poor ult usage, stuff like that kind of ended up costing them this series at times. Definitely a concern, right? You definitely have to be concerned about that. But those are the types of things you can fix. Those are the types of issues you want to have early in the season as opposed to late in the season. If they can clean up that type of stuff, the Gladiators are going to be just fine. I'm not concerned about this Gladiators roster at all. It was a great showing from the Fuel down the stretch in order to kind of win it. Big plays, especially out of Sparkle and Hanbin, I thought was very, very good in this series. So I think that was a big selling point for me on this Fuel roster was that play of Hanbin. So this, to me, is one of those matches that I think that they will play more throughout the season, whether it be in tournament qualifier matches and tournament semifinals, finals, whatever it may be. We're going to see more matchups from these teams, and I think over time it will, it could stick with Dallas, but I think this will be a very close series head-to-head as the season progresses. These are two very good teams. I would like to see these teams go up against San Francisco to see kind of where San Francisco's at, because we have an idea of where the Fuel and the Gladiators are at. They're very close together, but we don't know where they are at in comparison to the Shock, so that is what I'm excited to see as we kind of get closer now into this latter half of this first tournament cycle, seeing where we have with that. Final match on Saturday was the NYXL against the Vancouver Titans. NYXL finally got a win this season. My team did it, and it did not inspire me with any confidence. I did not think this team looked very good. Now, to be fair, I thought Vancouver looked significantly better in this match than they did in their match against the Mayhem. I thought the Titans looked much better with Aspire and Shockwave, which is what I had expected in the preseason. And I think that Sky Rippa looks better than Aztec. So I think they kind of figured out what's working for them. And they had a relatively close matchup at times with this New York Excelsior roster. I don't really think this New York Excelsior roster looks very good. I still have a lot of problems with the way that they built this roster. I think having two DPS players is a huge mistake. And I think having Gangnam Jin Myeonbong as your only two supports is a mistake. I think they needed a main support player. I think they needed a third DPS player. I really think Kellen is doing just fine. I think Kellen can do enough as a main tank that you don't need a second tank, but I think they need a main support, and I think they need a third DPS player to really fulfill this roster, what it could be. But what we saw is that when push comes to shove and you need your star players to pop off, they can. But these are two teams that I feel like are in a very similar position where they are going to win if their DPS players pop off. And that's it. That's really what it comes down to. They are not super well coordinated. They're sloppy. They're inconsistent. And this match really kind of showed that neither of these two teams really has it all put together. And I don't know how much of that comes down to coaching and how much of that comes down to just pure play style. I have some concerns about both of these teams' coaching staffs. Just, I've been a big fan for a while of Kuki, but I'm starting to think that maybe Kuki is not necessarily the coach that is the best option. I need to see more out of this team and see kind of what happens down the stretch, but I am a little concerned about what this team has been able to do, and so I'm curious to see how things go in the future. But New York did get a win. They did become the 5th team to beat all 19 other Overwatch League teams, so that was notable, and we'll talk about them more when we talk about their match against the Shock. Outlaws vs. Mayhem was a pretty close series, 3-2, back and forth. Outlaws won maps 1, 3, and 5. Mayhem won maps 2 and 4. I think these are two pretty close teams in terms of their overall performances. I think the Outlaws are slightly higher in terms of their skill and their talent. I think the Mayhem are a far more well-rounded roster. They have 3 supports, they have 2 tanks, they have 3 DPS players. I think that they have a far more well-rounded look. I think they have a lot of good talent. They have a really good coach who I believe in a lot with Gunba. And so this team to me is very interesting. And I think the fact that they pushed the Outlaws, pretty much to the end, says a lot about this Mayhem roster and how good they are. We all know the Outlaws are pretty talented. I think down the stretch, this Mayhem roster might be better than the Outlaws. I think that the Outlaws, like I said, right now, I feel like they're a little too one-dimensional, and I think that's something that can get read and can get checked. Flexibility, to me, is the key to success down the road and key to long-term success. That, to me, is what the Mayhem have, and I think they're a roster that are just kind of still getting things together. I don't think they're going to be a championship contender, but I definitely feel like I said before, they have that LA Valiant from 2020 kind of vibe to them, where they could be a really good team that just kind of has some big moments down the stretch. We just have to wait and actually see them in action as the season progresses to see if they get there. But these are two teams I think are interesting, and these are two teams that I think are both have an outside shot at getting into this current tournament cycle. I don't feel super confident in either of them making a run, but I definitely think one of them could make it in there, and at least do a little bit, to make a little bit of noise. Shock versus the New York Excelsior. I thought that the New York Excelsior looked fine on Kings Row. The rest of the series was whatever. It was just kind of what you would expect. New York Excelsior just need to figure out their identity more. Like I said, I think they need to make some roster additions. Realistically, that might not be able to happen at this point in the season because of, visa issues that some of the teams have been having and have commented on. So hopefully at some point here in the future, we can kind of see some of these teams that have some roster issues. We'll talk about one here in a second. Get some of those additions that they need so desperately, I think, to really bolster their roster. Now, the Shock are managing to do just fine with their somewhat limited roster, though they do have that DPS flexibility, which I think helps them out quite a bit. But I think the Shock, we're also seeing a very, 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 very heavy, strong performance from every piece on this roster. Every player has been playing very, very well. And I think that helps when you have a player like Violet, who is not necessarily playing his most comfortable heroes, but when the rest of his team around him is playing so well, it allows Violet to not be like the sore thumb. Right? He doesn't stand out because the rest of his team is doing very, very well. Which, you're going to have to get lucky for that to happen to some degree, but it happened for them, and so they feel pretty good. to watch. And so, definitely curious to see what happens over time with both of these teams, of course, as we've been talking about. But I think that, to me, what's really interesting is that there are a lot of interesting similarities between these teams, like I've said, right? One tank, 2 flex supports, but it's really that DPS flexibility, I think, is holding New York back. I think Yaki and Flora are both talented players. I don't think they have the flexibility they need. Like, this team doesn't have, like, someone who I would feel confident on Hanzo, which to me is, like, a huge thing. Like, Hanzo, of all heroes, like, I don't feel super confident this team can run Hanzo. They can't run double hit scan. They can't run Cassidy Ashe. They can't run, Ashe Widow or some, whatever. Maybe those are never meta, but they can't run something like that. They can't even run Widow Hanzo in my, what I've seen from these teams. So I'm concerned about this New York roster's ability to kind of succeed at making deep pushes and whatnot, because they just don't have that flexibility they think they need. And so I'm curious to see what happens going forward with them. The Shock, though, I think are a team that are going to be very interesting to watch, because it'll be cool to see if they're able to keep this performance up when they play some of those better talented rosters, or if we're just kind of seeing a team that's kind of riding on the fact that they're playing a lot of middling competition so far, that they've been able to really just kind of ride the backs of that so far. It'll be interesting to see, so I'm kind of curious to see it. Final match of the weekend was the Paris Eternal on the Toronto Defiant. Oh boy, do I have issues with the Paris Eternal. Oh boy. I was really, really, really happy when I saw this team add Wub, because I thought that the addition of Wub was a very good addition to help the team kind of round out their DPS line. Yeah, cool. 3 DPS players, nice flexibility, fixing one of the problems they had with this roster, which was the fact that they only had 2 DPS players and they couldn't run double hit scan. Heck yeah, that's great. And then they got rid of Naga. And I don't really agree with that move at all. I thought it was a bad move. I think that Naga is an incredibly talented player who've seen a lot out of this season and seasons past. And while, yes, Wub is a very flexible player who can play stuff like Genji and also play stuff like Widow, right? And he can play the Hanzo and he can play the Ashe, right? He will fill some of those kind of flex roles as well as that hit scan role. Naga is a very talented player who brought a lot to this team back in 2021, and I think that even this season he had some pretty, some decent looks so far. It's difficult when it's early in the season and you're kind of struggling. You play some good teams early on. But I just don't really understand that move, and I think some of it was probably just organizational, a lack of desire to have a lot of players in your roster. And so for me, this really was just kind of like a disappointing thing to see them do that, and then come out here their first week, the first match afterwards, and just completely rolled by the Defiant, who are a good team, don't get me wrong. It just really did not sit well with me. Just seeing this team do what they're doing is just, it bothers me. So for me, that's really kind of the storyline. This game was not very good. If you're an Eternal fan, it was a very one-sided affair for the Defiant. So a struggle for sure. And we'll just have to see what happens next week for both of these teams. I think the Defiant have a lot of momentum right now. I think they're going to keep a lot of that going. I think they look very strong still. When it comes to, though, the Eternal, I just think they don't look very good right now. And we'll see how much they're able to kind of continue some of this success going forward, but I don't feel all too confident about what I've seen out of them so far. So here's the standings real quick. If you want to see them, just throw them up there. So it's a little longer than I had originally anticipated it to be. A little passionate so far, but there you go. There's the standings, if you were curious where things are. My standings may look a little different from what you'll see on the Overwatch League website, but that doesn't matter so much right now. It'll matter more as the season kind of progresses, but there you go. That's what it is. That's what I've got for you. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want more like in the future, consider liking and subscribing. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.